Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started right on time because there's a lot of material to cover. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I also happen to be a political scientist, and I used to teach a class on state and local politics. So I started doing this session about 8 years ago, and it's proven popular. I get requests every year to keep doing it, so I figure if I'm going to do it for myself, I can share it with you, and we can all learn together. So the ballot initiatives this fall, for those of you who are new to California elections, some of you are coming out of state, we have the opportunity to vote on issues directly at the electorate level. So some of them are going to be framed as statutes, which are just changes to regular law. Others are going to be framed as constitutional amendments. And I've tried to highlight it for each of the propositions we're going to talk about today, which one is which, so that you can kind of follow along the things that you're supposed to be voting on. So I thought I want to just give you a framework to start with in terms of what our California budgetary expenses look like, because we've got both revenue bond issues to take a look at and then also expenditures, so that you have a framework. California's budget is always expressed in millions of dollars because we have a big budget. So right now we have a total combined expenditure of about $173 billion, which is a combination of general fund expenses, special funds that come through a variety of different sources, and then bonds that generate income for us. It's totaled there at the bottom, and you can see how the breakdown is listed in terms of major expenditure allocations. So the biggest allocation we have is for healthcare. Shouldn't surprise any from those of you who are in the healthcare industry. Our nurses and clinical folks, they know that the healthcare is our biggest cost. K through 12 is actually constitutionally the biggest, but I kind of take that for granted because K through 12 is 39% of our state budget. Healthcare is second, and then it goes into corrections and higher education, usually vies for third and fourth. So you can study that at your own leisure. In terms of revenue, income tax is our biggest revenue generator. So there's a proposition in this batch that we're going to look at today that's going to talk about a tax increase continuation. So that's something to keep in mind. We also have, as you can see, our second highest income generator is state sales tax. And then that's followed by corporate taxes. And the rest is kind of split among a variety of sources. In terms of our state liabilities, these are a compilation of all the outstanding debts that we have right now. That includes both bonds that we have sold and we have to pay back investors over an extended period of time. We also have an unfunded pension balloon payment that's going to start coming due shortly. And that's caused a lot of agitation among lawmakers, and our governor has spoken about this extensively. So you've got it broken down here, and again, it's expressed in millions of dollars. So our total outstanding debt for the state is $380 billion. And if you compare that with 2 slides ago, that's about double our current annual budget. So we spend about $176 billion. We owe an outstanding debt about $380 billion. So if you do the math, we owe 2 times more than we spend on a given year. The biggest concern right now is teacher pensions and state retiree health plans, because those right now have $0 set aside for that funding. And so when those teachers and other public employees start to retire, we don't currently have money set aside to fund those. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Because we have such a high debt to income or debt to expenditure ratio, our credit ratings have taken a hit over the last several years. They've slowly started to make improvements. Started with 2014, Prop 2 passed by the voters, started to chip away at some of those unfunded liabilities, and so Fitch and Moody's upgraded our credit rating as a state, which is the rate that we get to charge investors who buy our bonds. Right now we're still tied for last place, or second to last place, excuse me, with 3 other states. So Illinois is in the worst credit rating. They have a BBB rating. But we are tied for second to last with Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana. So they are equal to our credit rating. So it's one of the goals of the governor and the legislature to try to improve that over time. It not only helps generate more income, but it also improves our ability to refinance long-term debt as we take that on in the future. Okay, so that's just kind of all background information so that we can dive in and talk about some of these specific propositions. So the first one's a relatively simple one. Prop 51 is a school bond initiative. It basically asks the state, or you as voters would authorize the state to sell $9 billion worth of additional bond. So it'd be taking on debt. We'd sell the debt to our investors, and we'd pay them back over a 35-year period, both principal and interest. It's broken down, as you can see, accordingly: $3 million for new construction, $3 million for modernization, which includes both new equipment as well as infrastructure improvements, $2 billion for community college facility expansion, and then half a billion dollars for charter schools and $500 million for vocational centers, so vocational educational centers that would serve the broader community at large. The total cost would be roughly double what the initial cost would be. So after we pay back interest, it's going to be almost $18 billion. And the general fund would cover the interest payments in the over the next 35-year period. So they're looking at $500 million or $500 million over the next 35 years to pay that back. All proposals would be sent to the Office of Public School Instruction, and anything that would come through K through 12 would require some local buy-in. That would give local control, but also additional funds, whether it be land purchases or some shared building expenses, especially at the K through 12 level. So this is very typical in terms of arguments both in favor and opposed when it comes to bond issues. Those in favor say we have a need. We have a need to expand facilities. There's really no other way of doing it. We have to take on some temporary debt in order to accommodate that, and it's the only way to get it done. It's the first bond that funds school projects in 10 years, so there's a pent-up need to get some of these projects done. And the benefits of having these expanded facilities would be benefits to the community. Those opposed go back to the liabilities page and say we've already got almost $400 billion in debt already. The governor has actually come out strongly opposed to this. He said this is put on the ballot by a construction firm who would have personal interest if this were to pass, because they would be able to bid for the projects. And Governor Brown is also concerned about the equity of distribution of funds, because the way some of these projects have worked in the past is those districts who can afford to pay a consultant to put together the plans and the project proposals are typically the ones that get the bid, get the funding. And he said that sometimes is not fair because low-income districts can't afford to pay for a consultant to help with that project. Another opposition is that some of the technology that is described in the project proposal scope is designed to last 10 years, but it will take 35 years to repay the money. And so there's some question about value overall. Now, that doesn't address the facilities. Presumably, the facilities would be there for the long term. Okay. But it's really a very common pro-con decision. And for some of you, it aligns with kind of your own fiscal ideology, whether you like taking on state public debt in order to accomplish infrastructural projects, or whether you prefer to see those done on a more affordable piecemeal scale. It takes longer, and sometimes that causes problems. So that's Prop 51. Prop 52. This one's a little bit more complicated. It's the Medi-Cal hospital fee that's both a combined constitutional amendment and a statute. So what's happened in the past, over the last couple of years, starting with 2008, hospitals have paid a fee that allows the government to pay a matching fee, and that goes back to the hospitals in order to expand their Medi-Cal services. So Medi-Cal is the state version of Medicaid that we see at the federal level, and it's really designed to cover healthcare costs for people without insurance that are in a low-income bracket. In California, low income is really, it has an expanded definition. It's like low middle to low income. and it's a very common arrangement for folks who are in between jobs, or they don't have employer coverage and they're not making enough to qualify for other types of programs. Both public and private hospitals pay this fee. In California, there's a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 private hospitals for every 1 public hospital. And combined, the fee generated $4.6 billion in this last fiscal year, 2015-16. We applied for matching funds at the federal level, and an additional $4.4 billion came in from the federal government. Now, the federal government reauthorizes its matching funds every 2 years, and so the current arrangement is set until 2018, and will have to be revoted on by Congress after the next election cycle has sat a new Congress. So in this particular proposition, the statutory component would basically extend the program, and the constitutional amendment would require the legislature to modify the use of funds with a 2/3 vote. There were some criticisms in this last cycle because $900 million, approximately 20%, was diverted by the legislature away from healthcare costs into the general pot. And people thought that if it was a healthcare assessment fee that hospitals are paying, that it should really be earmarked for healthcare costs. And so this constitutional amendment would basically tell the legislature they can't do that anymore unless they pass it with a 2/3 vote, which is pretty hard to do in any given year. So that would kind of reserve those fundings. If the bill was extended, if the funding was extended, we reserve it just for healthcare costs. So in terms of in favor and opposed, as you can expect, there's a need to generate Medi-Cal funds, and so the hospital fee allows that to happen. It maintains our ability to receive those matching funds, so it's almost a 2-for-$1 allocation. The benefit from the constitutional amendment is that it keeps lawmakers from putting their hand in that piggy bank, and we've got a wide body of support from a variety of different officials, both bipartisan representation and hospital care administrators. There's really not much marshaled opposition to this. Initially, the Service International Union, Employees Union, SEIU, had come out against it because they thought it wasn't doing enough to earmark those funds just for patient care, because it goes back to the facilities themselves and it could be used to cover administrators' costs. And it's not necessarily earmarked just for patient care. But in the last couple of months, they've moved to a neutral position, and right now there's no registered opponent to this particular proposition. Okay. Oh, the other opposition too is on the 2/3 vote. Typically what we might see is an escape clause in case of fiscal emergency, if there's a catastrophic earthquake or something happened where the state needed to absorb a lot of funds in a quick period of time. There's often an opt-out provision on the 2/3 majority vote. There's not in this case. Most pundits don't believe it. It's really something that has to happen, but just to point that out as one of the opposition points.
Patient care.
California does not revere its constitution the way we do at the federal level, so we change it all the time. And in this case, it just allows for a little stricter threshold to move funds around. And we're going to see that pattern repeated in a couple of the other propositions too. So I forget how many thousands of times we've amended the state constitution, but it happens regularly, like all the time. Yeah. Okay, Prop 53 is another bond issue. This is a revenue bond. So there's basically 2 types of bond. There's a general obligation bond that is what Prop 51 addresses, where we take on a debt, we agree to sell bonds to finance a project, and then we pay back individual investors from the general operating fund, both principal and interest, and that's how we pay over a period of time. Revenue bonds are a little bit different. So this is typically done for infrastructural projects where we sell bonds, but instead of the revenue coming out of the general fund where it's backed by the full faith and credit of the state, we offset the future revenue generated from that project. So for example, for those of you who are from the Bay Area, you travel and you take one of the many bay bridges up in that area, you pay a fee every time you cross the bridge. Well, that infrastructural project was probably funded with a revenue bond, where the state ponied up the initial construction costs, but the investors were paid back not from the general budget, but by the tolls that are generated with each user's fee. And so there's revenue that comes from that project. It's not a revenue neutral project. And the revenue then is what pays back the investors. So there is some protection on the general state budget because it's not obligating the state to pay it back. The expectation is that the toll costs of a bridge project or the fast track funds on a freeway expansion project will generate enough income to pay back both principal and interest to those investors who bought those bonds. This has been controversial in the last couple of years because a revenue bond mechanism, which has been simply allowed with a straight majority vote in the legislature with no input from the voters, has been used to fund the bullet train project or the high-speed rail project that's been pretty controversial. Because there was no voter buy-in and the cost went from being a projection of $10 billion to now $60 billion. And there's question about whether there's ever going to be enough revenue generated from train riders to actually pay that back, and at what point does the state then become obligated to pay back from the general fund. So this is really kind of a revenue bond bill that's supposed to address that. It would ask voters to weigh in on any proposed project funded under this mechanism that costs more than $2 billion. And it would, there's a caveat in there that says you won't be able to split up the project into kind of piecemeal form in order to avoid that threshold. So the pros, it allows voters to have the opportunity to weigh in, to either approve or reject, just like they do right now for general obligation bonds. And it also then requires the state to estimate the full cost of the project, which right now they don't necessarily have to do. And that's also part of the controversy with the high-speed rail project. Per the Legislative Analyst's Office, that's LAO, there's really not that many projects that come up in any given time period that qualify for that threshold. $2 billion is a lot of money. And most projects come in well under that, so this would really be focused just on those very few that are high dollar, high capacity projects funded with revenue bonds, and there's not that many of them. There's a broad support from Republican and Libertarian parties, as well as the taxpayer associations and various groups. On the opposition side, there's some question about whether local projects would be impacted. So there's a back and forth in the literature. If you look through your voter guide, one saying local projects won't be impacted, the other saying yes, they will, and it would require, you know, an infrastructural project rebuilding program that maybe is, you know, a couple of different counties to be voted on by the whole state at large, and that could be problematic. So I went back into the actual proposed code, and this is where the asterisk is, and you can probably see it better on your handout. The language itself, this is a direct quote, does not apply to any city and county, school district, community college district, or special district performing local government functions within limited boundaries. So in a sense, it wouldn't apply just to a city project. You wouldn't have to have all state approval by voters if you were going to fix the aqueduct issue here in Glendora or Azusa. Where it gets a little dicier, though, is that special water districts that extend over a broader geographical area potentially could be impacted. And that's where the language is a little muddy, and it will likely have to be litigated if it's approved to see whether or not that would be impacted. The concern would be if you have a Southern California municipal water issue, and if it went to a statewide vote, would voters across the state support that? Or they reject it because they don't fully understand the implications, or maybe that it doesn't affect them and so they don't feel invested in it. There's some question about that. There's some back and forth about emergencies, whether emergency construction projects would be impacted. The other side says, well, we never build, we never rebuild freeways that have collapsed from an earthquake using revenue bonds. There's other mechanisms that are better suited for that. And so if that were to happen, this probably wouldn't apply because that's not a good funding mechanism for it. We do see opposition by the Democratic Party and some local government associations. That includes your city organizations, your county organizations, and regional ones like SANDAG, which is the San Diego area governments. Okay, a couple questions. Yes?
So essentially,
yes and no. I mean, I don't know that it's an actual mistrust piece as much as these are decisions that impact all of California, so they should have, voter input just like the other bonds. It's a bit of an anomaly not to have voter input. I think that would be the response. But, I'll be honest, it does come out of the frustration with a couple of these high expense projects that had no voter input, and some groups felt disenfranchised because of that.
Is going to become more rudimentary.
This one is indexed for inflation, so it would be continuously adjusted. It's not always, that's a good question, but this one is. Because you're right, over time, $2 billion doesn't become, what we think $2 billion is, right? Yeah. I mean, it's still real money, but, at some point it's less real money than before. Okay, so legislative proceedings is Prop 54, and just for all full disclosure, this is one that I have a little bit of personal experience with just this past summer with the SB 1146, so I'll share a little bit about that, and I want to just have that full disclosure so that I may not have a completely objective perspective on this. Basically, what this bill is saying is that before the legislature can vote on any given measure, the current version, including all of the amendments, have to be made available in public via the internet and also distributed to all members 72 hours before the vote is taken. Otherwise, the vote is considered null and void. And the reason I mentioned SB 1146 is because I personally experienced what happens when the amendments, what we saw happen at least in 2 committee meetings, amendments were given in oral form or in draft form. They were reported on in oral form on the committee, but no one actually saw the text. A vote was taken based upon that oral report without having members given the opportunity to actually review the language, only to find out that what they thought was in the bill wasn't really in the bill, or things that were in the bill they didn't think were in the bill because they didn't actually have the text in front of them when they took the vote. So there was some confusion that happened on a regular basis, and so I just wanted to share that little bit of experience, and you can tuck it away or ignore it. But that may be part of the reason for some of this proposal. There's also a component, this is both statutory and constitutional amendment. So this is all constitutional amendment that this would affect our legislative proceedings. It would also require all open meetings to be video recorded. Right now, there's anything that doesn't have confidential personnel decisions related to it has to be done in open meeting where public's invited. This would now say that it has to be video recorded and archived for 20 years on the internet so that people can download it at will. And that if anyone wants to show up at an open meeting and video record for themselves, that they are permitted to do so. So this would change the constitutional language to make that happen. In terms of statutory changes, it's really just a couple. It makes sure that anyone who uses that video recording isn't going to be in trouble with the state as long as they're using it for a legitimate purpose, and that could include a legitimate political purpose, and that there's no fees attached with downloading the videos that are archived by the state. That's another question. You can, lead the horse to water. Do they actually drink? We don't know, right? Maybe, maybe not. It does help, I think, with, promoting transparency and openness, because then voters can hold them accountable. If that's important to voters, they'll have that ability to hold them accountable. So in favor, that's kind of the first argument in favor, is to say this promotes honesty and openness and transparency so that everyone knows what the bill is saying at the time it's voted on. I think there's also the hope, at least, that it will prevent special interest groups from kind of hijacking the legislative process, because what happens sometimes in the sausage-making business of legislation is that special interest groups will sit down with the lawmakers, they'll craft out language that they are supportive of, and then that language is adopted on before people are understanding how the special interests have been involved. And we saw a little bit of that with the summer of SB 1146 too. We saw some efforts in the US Senate to try to implement a 72-hour waiting period, so there's some mirroring there, what's happening at the federal level. And there is an exception in case of a declared emergency. So if Brown needs to rush something through the legislature, because executives in the state of California can introduce legislation, or if the legislature wants to vote on something quickly because of an emergency measure, this would be suspended in times of emergency. And we see that it's got a pretty widespread support by both Republican and Libertarian parties, League of Women Voters, and a variety of different civic groups and organizations. Those opposed point out that this is really kind of the pet project of one billionaire person who was able to fund the signature gathering process, and so therefore it may not represent kind of the constituency's wish as a whole. They would point out that every time anything is changed, even if it's on a technical thing, like you insert a comma or you remove a clause that really is not substantive, it would start the 72-hour waiting period all over again, and could cause lengthy delays and cause a backup in legislation. There also is concern that if everything is video recorded and archived in perpetuity on the internet, that getting parties together to carve out bipartisan solutions might be a little bit harder. And here's the political reality that is grounded in the research that says voters today think political compromise is a bad word, right? Because we painted each of the parties in a negative light, and so the thought of Republicans and Democrats sitting down at the same table and carving out a compromise and having that videoed and then archived and used by opponents in attack ads might actually increase. And so having everything videotaped and disseminated broadly perhaps isn't a good idea for the legislative process. It's opposed by the Democratic Party, who's the majority party in Sacramento, as well as the NOW and various employee union groups who have a lot of legislation that they're usually involved in. Yes?
Is there a cost involved with this too?
Minimal cost. So they estimate about $1 million to purchase and upgrade new video recording equipment and storage, internet storage capabilities, but they said it could be easily covered in the existing funds that are allocated to the legislature. Okay, anything else? One thing that I didn't point out, but it's on the slide, that we encountered, at least the prospect of this past summer with SB 1146, is this fun little thing that only Californians do called gut and amend, where at the very end of the legislative year, if you've run out of time to start the process over because you want to make some substantive changes and you don't have time to bring it all the way back through committee, you can take an existing bill that's already made it through the process and is awaiting the governor's signature, and if it aligns in the same general area in the code as the bill that you're proposing, you can bring that finished bill and basically strip it of its content, right? Think of a cell, you just take the nucleus right out, and then you take this other bill that you want to insert and you just plop it in and you present that for final approval and governor's signature. So as we were kind of wrestling with the what could possibly happen in late August, our lobbyists in Sacramento said, well, there's always the prospect of a gut and amend, which would be not great from advocacy position, because it would mean no time to try to go back and correct anything that we didn't object to. So. Okay, Prop 55, tax extension. This is a constitutional amendment. So a few years ago, you might remember, Californians voted on a temporary tax increase. This was recommended by the governor right as we were dealing with our recession and our budget coffers were down and we had a hard time staffing our schools. This was meant to increase income tax on single earners making more than $250,000, head of household making $140,000, and then joint filers making more than $500,000. And it's set to expire in 2018. So the proposal is to change the Constitution to extend this to 2030. And the revenues, like the original Prop 30, would be earmarked for K through 12 schools, community colleges, and healthcare programs, just as they are today. We also see that the original language that was included in Prop 30, which says that it can't be used for educational administrator costs, is also included in this version as well. So it's basically taking Prop 30 that was passed a few years ago and extending it to 2030. So some of the pro-con arguments are very similar to what we saw in Prop 30. There's a concern that, or I'll start with the favor, this is no new tax increases. So we've already adjusted to these tax increases. It wouldn't be adding to any tax increases. It would just be continuing what's already in place. And that the funds right now are controlled by local school districts. It's not being determined by Sacramento, which maximizes the impact of local officials on the distribution of those funds. Right now it's generating about an extra $4 billion a year, and of course with income tax that's variable. In economically good years that could be more, in recession years that could be less, but over the last year it's been about $4 billion. And the original Prop 30 had some pretty strict audit controls, and those are maintained in this extension. It's supported by Democrats, a lot of Democratic officials, education officials, healthcare officials, because it would right now, because education is fully funded with this tax increase, it allows healthcare to also be funded to the maximum it can get, and so the healthcare professionals are on the side of support, and of course many school districts want to support it. On the opposed side, the opponent's primary argument is that we're in a different fiscal situation than we were when Prop 30 was initially voted on. Then we were in a deep recession, we had budget deficits, and now we have a budget surplus. So is the tax necessary? They're arguing that it's not, that schools are fully funded. In fact, there's a surplus beyond fully funding K through 12 schools, and it could be something that is not necessary, viewed as not necessary any longer. They also point out, as they did when Prop 30 was on the ballot initially, that the income tax also affects small businesses, because small businesses that are non-incorporated are treated as individual income. And it is a difficult burden for many small businesses to overcome, because it's not just personal income, it's their business income, and therefore it impacts small businesses more heavily than it would individual filers. And the one thing that didn't get pointed out, but I thought would be helpful because it was someone brought it up earlier, is it indexed for inflation. This is not. And so while I don't know how much incomes are likely to gravitate upward in the next 12 to 18 years, between the initial Prop 30 and 2030, when it's scheduled to sunset, but people who were making $500,000 or $250,000 back in 2012, there might be more of them, or more businesses at least, in 2030 when this expires. So it could affect a broader percentage of the electorate that the lawmakers didn't initially envision. That's kind of also the argument, is that this only is supposed to affect a very small slice of the top income earners, which can be viewed as a negative, because if you don't have broad buy-in by the electorate, that can erode participation over time. So the fact that it's not indexed for inflation could mean more people are paying higher taxes, and maybe that would bring in greater participation. I don't know. So it's both a pro and a con, depending on how you look at it. It's opposed by Republicans, various taxpayer associations, and Chamber of Commerce because of the impact on small businesses. Okay, moving along. Prop 56, cigarette tax. So earlier in your handout, I gave you an income revenue breakdown, and there was a line item in there for cigarette tax. Right now, there's an excise tax placed on every pack of cigarettes that is 87 cents in its current form. There's a federal excise tax of $1.01 that also applies, but all that money goes back to Washington, and Congress controls how that's spent. So out of the 87 cents that we currently assess on cigarette taxes, that money is allocated for a variety of different functions. What this is proposing is an additional $2 per pack, or 10 cents per cigarette, that would generate extra revenue. But this is a both combined statutory and constitutional amendment provision. So the statutory changes would, one, expand the definition of a tobacco product so that e-cigarettes and other types of nicotine delivery systems would be impacted, where right now they're not. It would increase 10 cents a cigarette and an equivalent amount for e-cigarettes. And all of the revenue then would be allocated to various programs, the primary share being healthcare programs. And it's not just tobacco-related healthcare programs, it really goes into Medi-Cal. So $700 million to $1 billion potentially would be redirected to Medi-Cal from this excise tax. 13% of the revenue funds would come in would be redirected to tobacco prevention programs and control programs. There's a concern about youth being attracted to e-cigarette delivery systems, and so that some of this would be offsetting to combat that. And then 5%, to get to Emily's question earlier, this is where we see medical research directly funded. This would go to the UC system that does medical research, and it would be really earmarked for cancer and other tobacco-related diseases to try to improve the research on those conditions. The constitutional change would basically preserve those funds. They wouldn't be allowed to be lumped into the general revenue. So it would not increase the amount of funding that you would see on that first couple of pages. The cigarette tax wouldn't necessarily triple in size because these funds would be off books. They wouldn't be counted part of the general revenue. They would be set aside specifically for these programs. And so that would require a constitutional amendment change. Anything that's shielded from the general fund is something we have to allocate in the Constitution. So pros and cons, there's often a philosophical objection to excise taxes, or sin taxes as they're often called. One of the pros, though, is that higher taxes has been known to depress demand. And since cigarette smoking and nicotine products are usually considered bad for one's health, less demand is often considered to be a good thing. The funding would be used in many cases to prevent increased participation by youth, so the tobacco prevention programs are directed specifically in that area. And the thought is that this is almost like a user's fee. As smokers generate more healthcare costs, it's only fair to ask them to pay an increasing amount that would be redirected back to healthcare. It's supported by Democrats, a bunch of health nonprofits, and ethnic community organizations, and that's probably because the research shows that there's a strong correlation between socioeconomic status, including ethnic background, and tobacco use. On the opposed side, there's a concern that it's just funding Medi-Cal, it's just an alternate revenue stream for Medi-Cal, and that really by taking it out of the general fund, it's also depriving schools of their share of increased revenue that Prop 98 would otherwise require. So Prop 98's been on the books for a while now, and it says that 39% of all income needs to be directed to K through 12 and community college schools. And so by taking this offline out of the general fund, they're saying that this would deprive schools of that funding, which they estimate to be about $600 million in a given period of time. It's interesting that so the bracketed is really my observation. There was a number of law enforcement groups that opposed this, but without saying why. We do know from research, though, that when costs of contraband, in this case it's not really, it's allowed, but it's a costly product, if it increases to a particular level, it could generate additional black market activity. So this would bring a package of cigarettes to $8 a pack, which is substantial enough that you might see thefts increasing, some black market activity, illegal exports or imports from different countries or different areas, or it could trigger an increase in illegal narcotics as people look to get their fix from other cheaper substances. And next week, if you come back, we'll talk about the marijuana legalization proposition, which is in the second session, and that could be an interesting dynamic. If cigarettes go too high in terms of retail cost, will that increase demand for legalized marijuana if that proposition were to be funded? So just kind of an interesting dynamic there. So opposed by Republicans and a bunch of law enforcement agencies and taxpayer groups. Prop 57, this is another one that I have a little bit of a disclaimer about because there's a corollary piece that affects three-strike sentencing. And for those of you who know me or know of me, much of my research around sentencing policy has been focused on three-strikes law. So just want to throw that out there. constitutional changes. There's basically two main thrusts of this bill. One is that it would allow quote-unquote nonviolent offenders to be eligible for parole as soon as their initial term is completed, their initial prison term is completed. And the second piece is that it would allow good time credits that would qualify someone for early release consideration, again with parole approval. So it's not just an open up the door and let you go. You have to go through a parole board, but if the parole board agrees that they're fit to be released back into society, that could even come earlier than what their defined sentence looks like if they complete certain educational programs, rehabilitation programs, or they behave well in prison. The statutory change comes with how we treat juvenile offenders. Right now, goes back now, I think, to 2000, voters approved a measure that authorized the prosecution of very violent juvenile offenses in adult criminal court for juveniles as young as 14 and 15. And this would basically remove the automatic transfer provision. Right now, all juvenile offenses are adjudicated in juvenile court, except if they fall into this violent offense category, and then it's an automatic transfer to criminal court. This removes the automatic transfer piece and requires the prosecutor to make a case before the juvenile court judge, but ultimately the juvenile court judge then would have discretion to say yes or no. So that would potentially affect how juvenile cases are handled in the state of California. Yeah, so it would negate, so after that core term is sentenced, so if someone was, say, sentenced to 5 years in prison, I'm just throwing that out there, 5 years, and they were a three-striker, they might have a doubled sentence, or in some cases a tripled sentence, or a minimum sentence of 25 years to life. There's also enhancements for different types of qualifiers. So if you've been to prison before and you get sent back to a prison, you could have a prison prior enhancement ranging anywhere from 5 to 10 years. If you are convicted of an offense where you used a gun for the commission of that offense, there's also a, I think it's 2 years in its current form, 2-year enhancement that comes with gun use. So this would basically take all those enhancements off the table for nonviolent offenders. And if they were able to satisfy their core term, they could come up before a parole board for early or scheduled release. Right now, if you're a three-striker, there is no parole. You have to do your whole term and then you get to go. If you have other enhancements, you can come up for parole consideration after 85% of your sentence is completed, but not before. So if you had a 5-year sentence and then a 5-year prison prior, your total sentence is 10 years, you have to do 85% of your 10-year sentence before you could come for parole, come before the parole board. This says after that initial 5-year sentence is done, then you can come up before the parole board. The parole board could say, nope, you're not ready yet, or they could say yes, and you're free to go. So it essentially could negate those sentencing enhancements that voters already approved in the past. So along the lines of criminal sentencing measures, you get a lot of philosophical pros and cons. Here, there's really more of an emphasis on the pragmatic in addition to the philosophical. Right now, we are under a federal mandate to reduce our prison capacity down to 110,000 inmates. 7 years ago, the high was 160,000, and we've been slowly reducing that number to be in compliance with federal mandates. The federal system took over our court system, or our prison system, back in the early 2000s because they viewed our system as being cruel and unusual punishment because of the overcrowding conditions. So it got pretty contentious during the Schwarzenegger administration, where they threatened to imprison him for contempt of court if he didn't take immediate corrective action. And I don't know if Brown's paying attention to that, but he's been intent about dialing back our prison population. So this is just one in a number of series of decisions and legislative enactments that have tried to make that possible. From Brown's perspective, he's come out and said, he's actually the strong proponent behind this measure. He said that inmates need an incentive to behave well. They need an incentive to participate in rehabilitation programs and educational programs, because we do not coerce inmates into participating. They have to do it voluntarily. So that would re-incentivize participation in those programs. And then for juvenile offenders, the research is pretty clear that when you transfer them over at 14 or 15 to adult court, you're basically taking rehabilitation off the table. And you know, there's lots of research on both sides as to whether or not that's even effective to begin with, but that's partly what's driving this. On the opposition side, there's concern about the use of the term nonviolent, because the way California defines violent and nonviolent offenses, it's not how you and I might define violent or nonviolent offenses. It's a statutory designation in the California Code, and right now under the list of violent offenses, there are 23 crimes listed. And there's a bunch of other stuff that is not listed under the violent category, but might be something that you and I, the average person, would consider violent. So for example, rape of an intoxicated person or rape of an unconscious person is not one of the 23 violent offenses. But the average person would say, I think that's kind of violent, you know. Assault with a deadly weapon, that's AWDW. Assault with a deadly weapon is not considered a violent crime under that list of 23 offenses. But if you ask the average Californian, they might disagree. They might say, I think that is a violent offense because of the potential for harm and the fear that goes along with it. Same with human trafficking, and there's a number of others that the opponents list as being crimes that the average person would consider violent, but would not be affected by this bill because it's not listed as one of those 23 offenses. So they were saying if you were in prison for human trafficking of a minor for sexual gain, you could come up for parole without having to do any of your sentencing enhancements, and that potentially could impact public safety. And that's their big concern. So if you see the opponent list, it's almost, well, the Republicans, but then almost every law enforcement agency in the state of California, and 32 of the 58 DAs have also personally named their opposition to it. And then going back to the voter concern is that over the last 20 years, voters have repeatedly approved sentencing enhancements that would basically be overturned with this one proposition. So that's something for voters to have to decide if that's something they want to do or not. Yeah, it's under PC 667.5 subsection C. And that's actually true, and I do know that because I used to have all 23 memorized at one point. I don't any longer, but that's where you find it in the penal code. Yeah.
Is that going to be on the quiz?
Not this time around. Next week, though. All right, this is really the last one. I'll show you why Prop 59 is an easy one, but this last one is English proficiency. Back in 1998, voters enacted Prop 227, which basically gutted bilingual education programs in K-12 settings. The goal was to try to provide an English-only immersion setting so that students who were struggling to learn English would have kind of a dedicated immersive space. There was a one-year bilingual provision if parents signed a waiver, but by and large it basically said we're only teaching in English. So for those of you who are in School of Ed or you know friends who are in School of Ed, this was a radical change to how we approach bilingual education. This, in a sense, would reverse that. So it would reintroduce multilingual programs, both for non-native speakers as well as for native speakers. So the goal is to try to prepare K-12 students who are versed and culturally competent, and that includes language skills in a variety of different contexts. It's very much geared towards district input, so there's actually a provision in the statute that's proposed that would say district officials must consult parents and community members as to how they want to embrace or limit bilingual or multilingual education. And if parents demand an English-only or immersive environment, the district also has to provide that as well. In terms of the requirement for changes, under the original constitutional version in Prop 227, it required a 2/3 vote, but now this would, if this is approved, it would revert that back to a simple majority for the legislature. So if they wanted to tinker with this going forward, they wouldn't have to have such a high threshold for support. So the pros and cons look an awful lot like what we saw with Prop 227 20 years ago. The proponents say that bilingual education, multilingual education is an important part of our educational system. We have a responsibility to non-native speakers to provide instruction in their native language while we are also teaching them English. And there's also a desire to expand multilingual offerings for native speakers, native English speakers, so that they can become increasingly proficient at the K-12 level in languages other than English. And with the community control, they feel like there's a way to do that in a way that's consistent with parents and other school officials. It's supported by the Democrats, pretty much every school district in California, and teachers associations and unions. On the opposition side, there's concern that we're throwing out something that appears to have worked. Over the last 20 years, our English proficiency has improved, that students who are non-native speakers and kind of languishing in these dual language programs are now acquiring English proficiency at better rates. And there's concern about dialing that back and going back to a system that doesn't work any longer. There's also a concern that with a lowered threshold for legislative approval, that it may allow for tinkering that kind of moves us away from English proficiency as the stated goal to something that's not as clear. And with our current legislature, they said that that might be something that is revisited at some point. So there's an organization called English Only that's opposed this measure, along with the Republican and Libertarian parties and the original founder of Prop 227, Ron Unz. Yeah, so there would be two components. One for non-native speakers so that they can receive instruction perhaps in the language that they speak at home or the language that they feel more comfortable in while they're also learning English, but it also would be available to native speakers who want to, say, become proficient in Spanish or become proficient in French or something that they think would prepare them better for global economy opportunities. The Legislative Analyst's Office says that it's really an unknown because we don't know exactly how districts are going to implement that, and it's really depending on the school district's budget. So there's no additional funds earmarked for school districts. So they're able to expand as their budgets are able to accommodate that. So it'd have to be done within the existing revenue source. So it's possible that in the future, local districts like Azusa or Bonita or something would come back to the voters and say, we would like to expand our multilingual programs and we want you to pay for it, but right now there's no revenue dedicated for this.
Within that.
It is a state definition. The measurement or the outcome associated with that used to be the high school graduation exam. I think that's been suspended. To be honest, there may be a replacement measure and I'm just not familiar with it. Last one, this is an easy one. Prop 59 is a symbolic vote, whether or not you want the legislature to recommend a constitutional amendment at the federal level to overturn the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus the FEC. And it absolutely has no binding capability whatsoever. I promise you the Constitution will never be amended this way. It's really a proxy vote as to whether you like the Supreme Court's vote or decision in Citizens United or not. And for those of you who have no idea what Citizens United is, it was a Supreme Court decision that basically said that corporations are fictitious persons. This goes back to our common law heritage in the late 1700s. We've always said that corporations are fictitious persons. It allows them to have access to the courts, buy property, be sued, face criminal charges. But in this case, it affected corporate spending in election campaigns. So the Supreme Court said that they had free speech rights as a fictitious person, and therefore speech couldn't be limited arbitrarily by a dollar amount that the Congress had implemented to try to curb influence in campaign spending. So this, in a sense, would be a ratification of the legislature's desire to repeal that. In order to get the U.S. federal Constitution amended, Congress has to vote with a majority vote in both houses, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify, and that's never going to happen. So don't tie yourself up in pretzels over that. It's a pretty, it's one that you can probably skip and feel just fine about it, or take a gut check vote, because it makes no difference whatsoever. All right, thanks. I'll be around for questions, and I'll see you. Yeah. Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, so next time we'll do 61 through 67, 60 through 67 if you want to come. They're recording this, so I'm going to try to upload it quickly, hopefully before Election Day. Thanks. Same time, same place. Yeah, next Monday. Yeah.